Grace on Main Street. Chapter 1. The Evening Stall. The sun was dipping low in the Kansas sky, casting long orange streaks across the quiet town of Millbrook. A dusty wind carried the faint whistle of a train as it approached the old railway station, a place that once bustled with travelers but now only saw a handful of daily passengers. On the edge of the cracked pavement, a small folding table stood. Upon it rested two large glass jars filled with golden brown cookies, and beside them a tall pitcher of lemonade, its surface beaded with cold condensation. Behind the table stood Grace Miller, 82 years old, her back slightly bent, but her spirit remarkably straight. Her hair, white as freshly fallen snow, was neatly tied into a bun, and her hands, though frail and wrinkled, moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime pouring love into simple tasks. She wiped down the table, straightened the cups, and arranged a handwritten sign that read, "Homemade cookies and lemonade, $1 each." Every evening, Grace made this walk from her modest home on Maple Street to the railway station. The distance wasn't far, but at her age, each step was a careful balance between determination and fatigue. When asked if the journey was too much for her, she would only smile faintly and reply, "The walk keeps me alive." That evening, a young boy of about 10 rode up on his bicycle. His name was Charlie, one of the neighborhood kids who had taken a liking to Grace. He skidded to a stop, grinning wide, and said, "Mrs. Miller, do you have the chocolate chip ones today?" Grace chuckled, her eyes lighting up. "Of course, Charlie. I baked them just this morning." She reached into the jar and handed him a cookie, wrapped in a napkin. Charlie placed 2 crumpled dollar bills on the table, one for me and one for my mom. She says yours tastes better than the store-bought kind. Grace smiled warmly, slipping the bills into a tin box. "Tell your mama I said thank you, and that the secret ingredient is always love." The boy laughed, stuffed the cookie into his mouth, and pedaled away. Grace watched him go, her heart warmed by the simple exchange. These moments, brief, ordinary, yet filled with connection, were what kept her coming back day after day. As the evening wore on, commuters trickled out of the railway station. Some stopped for a cup of lemonade to quench their thirst. Others picked up cookies for the ride home. A few just paused to chat, sharing fragments of their day with the elderly woman who listened with patient ears and a gentle smile. Not everyone knew Grace's story. To most, she was simply the old woman who sold cookies at the station. But for those who took the time to ask, they learned of her journey, a journey marked by love, loss, and resilience. Later that evening, a young college student named Sarah approached. She had been noticing Grace for weeks, but had never stopped before. "Hi," she said shyly. "I'd like 2 lemonades." Grace poured the drinks carefully into paper cups and handed them over. Sarah hesitated for a moment before asking, "Mrs. Miller, why do you do this? I mean, most people your age are at home resting." Grace paused. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the sun was almost gone. Then she looked back at Sarah with a steady gaze. "Because resting doesn't pay the bills, dear. And because I would rather stand on my feet and work than sit at home and wait for help that may never come." Sarah was quiet, struck by the firmness in Grace's voice. She handed over a $5 bill. "Keep the change," she said softly. "No, sweetheart, I don't take charity. You'll get 5 lemonades for that." Sarah smiled, realizing that this woman's pride was not of arrogance, but of dignity. She accepted the extra cups, and as she walked away, she thought about the lesson she had just witnessed, that strength is not measured by youth, but by the refusal to surrender.
As the night drew in, Grace packed up her table. She poured the remaining lemonade into a flask to take home and sealed the cookie jars tightly. With slow, deliberate movements, she folded her table and tucked it under her arm. The railway station grew quiet again, the last rays of sunlight fading into darkness. Her walk home was lit by street lamps, each pool of light a small step towards the sanctuary of her modest house. Inside, the kitchen smelt faintly of sugar and flour, remnants of the morning's baking. On the counter sat an old recipe book, its pages stained and dog-eared. It belonged to her daughter, Emily. Grace traced her fingers across the handwritten notes in the margins, little adjustments Emily had made to the recipes. Add a pinch of cinnamon here. Another said, try baking 2 minutes less for softer cookies. Grace closed the book gently, her eyes moist. I hope you're proud of me, Emily. I'm still baking, just like we dreamed. She made herself a simple supper, soup and bread, then sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. The silence was heavy, but not unbearable. She had found a way to fill it, through work, through service, through keeping alive the memory of those she had lost. Before bed, she counted the day's earnings. $23. It wasn't much, but it was enough for groceries and a little extra toward the electricity bill. She placed the money neatly in an envelope labeled house, then whispered a short prayer of gratitude. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, Grace thought of tomorrow. Another day, another batch of cookies, another evening at the station. She was tired, yes, but her heart carried a quiet strength. And in that strength lay her dignity. The dignity of a woman who refused to give up, even when life had taken so much.
Chapter 2. Yesterday's Light. The mornings in Millbrook were always calm. Birds sang from the maple trees, and the small town stirred awake slowly like a child reluctant to rise from bed. Grace, however, had always been an early riser. Long before her evening routine at the railway station began, her life followed a different rhythm, one that revolved around her family, her classroom, and her kitchen. Back when she was younger, Grace was known as Miss Miller, the teacher who baked cookies for her students. Her classroom at Millbrook Elementary smelled faintly of chalk dust and sugar, because every Friday she would bring in a tin of her famous cookies. It was her way of rewarding hard work and making children feel special. Grace wasn't rich, not in the way people often measured wealth. But her life was rich with laughter, small joys, and the love of her husband, John Miller. John was a postman, steady, reliable, the kind of man who whistled every morning on his way to work. Together, they built a life that was simple but full of warmth. The greatest blessing came in the form of their daughter. Emily was born on a spring afternoon when daffodils bloomed across the countryside. Grace remembered the way John held the baby for the first time, his hands trembling as though he were cradling the most fragile treasure in the world. He kissed the child's forehead and whispered, "Welcome, little miracle." From the very beginning, Emily filled their small house with light. She had curious eyes and a laugh that could soften the hardest day. Grace delighted in teaching her daughter everything she knew, from tying shoelaces to baking her first batch of cookies. "Too much sugar, Mama?" Emily asked one afternoon when she was about 8 years old. Grace leaned over the bowl, smiling. "Not if you plan to share with your friends. Sweetness multiplies when you give it away." It became their motto,
one that Emily carried into her teenage years. She grew into a young woman with a kind heart, always eager to help others. At the local church fair, Emily would set up a little booth next to her mother's, selling cookies and lemonade side by side. "One day, Mama," she often said, "we'll have a bakery, a little shop with a red door and windows filled with pies. We'll call it Grace and Emily's Co." Grace would laugh, pat her daughter's cheek, and reply, "We'll see, sweetheart. Dreams take work." The years passed in gentle succession. Family dinners, Sunday services, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes. Life was not without its struggles, but the Miller household met them with resilience. Until the day everything changed. John passed away suddenly when Grace was 65. It was a heart attack, swift and unforgiving. Grace remembered the phone call, the numbness that followed, the way the world seemed to blur. Emily, then in her 20s, became her mother's anchor. She held Grace's hand through the funeral, through the lonely nights, through the hollow silence that filled their home. "Mama," Emily had whispered one evening as they sat together at the kitchen table, "we still have each other. We'll be okay." And for a time, they were. Grace retired from teaching, and Emily pursued a career in social work. She was passionate about helping others, children, families, the elderly. "The world needs kindness, Mama. If we can give even a little, it matters." But life, cruel as sometimes is, tested them again. Emily fell ill at 43. What began as fatigue and unexplained aches soon revealed itself as something far more devastating: cancer. Grace could still recall the sterile smell of the hospital, the endless series of tests, the doctor's carefully measured words. "We'll try treatment, but it's aggressive. We'll do everything we can." Emily fought bravely. She smiled through her pain, reassuring her mother even as her body weakened. "Mama, don't cry," she would whisper. "We still have today." Grace spent every moment by her daughter's side. She cooked meals Emily could barely eat, read aloud from her favorite books, and prayed fervently for a miracle. Each day, she clung to hope like a lifeline, even as she watched the lights in her daughter's eyes fade little by little. On one quiet evening, Emily reached for her mother's hand. Her voice was soft, almost a breath. "Promise me something, Mama. Promise me you won't stop living when I'm gone. Promise me you'll keep baking, keep smiling, because your cookies, your love, it's what makes life sweet." Grace tried to answer, but tears choked her voice. She only nodded, clutching her daughter's fragile hand as if holding it tightly enough could keep her in the world. Emily passed away that night. The room was still, the monitor flatlined, and Grace felt as though her very soul had been torn from her. She was 79 years old, a widow, and now without her only child. The days that followed blurred into one another. The house felt unbearably silent, every corner echoing with memories. The recipe book on the counter, Emily's notes scribbled in the margins, was both a comfort and a torment. Neggers came with casseroles and condolences, but when the dishes were empty and the visitors gone, Grace was left with the truth. She was alone. Bills began to pile up. Retirement savings dwindled quickly, eaten away by medical costs. Friends suggested she apply for assistance, perhaps move into a senior home. But Grace could not bear the thought of living on charity or surrendering her independence. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at Emily's recipe book, a thought sparked. If she could not bring Emily back, perhaps she could keep her alive in another way. By baking, by sharing, by carrying forward the dream they once held together. Grace rose from her chair, wiped her tears, and tied on her apron. Flour dusted the air as she began to mix sugar, butter, and eggs. The smell of cookies filled the kitchen once more, bringing with it memories of laughter, of Emily's hands guiding hers. She baked until her counter overflowed with golden, warm cookies. Then she filled 2 jars, poured a pitcher of lemonade, and walked to the railway station. That first evening, she sold only a handful. But the next day, a few more. And the day after that, even more. Slowly, people began to recognize her presence, to stop for a cookie and a kind word. Grace had found a way to honor her daughter's memory, to support herself, and to live with dignity. Her past, filled with both joy and heartbreak, was now the foundation of her present. And though Emily was gone, her spirit lingered in every cookie baked, every smile shared, every dollar earned honestly at the railway station.